Session 5: Competition, Conflict, and Cooperation. Introduction. People often have incompatible goals, placing them in conflict with one another. This study session discusses how interpersonal conflict exists, the processes of conflict escalation. We will cap the session with a discussion on means of reducing conflicts. Outcomes. Point out sources of conflict escalation. Profile conflict resolution techniques and explain social dilemma. Conflict escalation. Conflict between groups are caused by many factors, including competition for scarce resources, stereotypes and prejudice, and competing ideologies. But once a conflict is in place, it can feed on itself. Rather than burn itself out after a time, a conflict left unattended often grows in intensity, and the number of people involved increases as well. Dust, 1973, refers to this cause as the conflict spirals. Conflict spirals are frequent, as one party annoys the other party, who retaliates, prompting a mere extreme reaction from the first party, and so on. There are a host of factors that conspire to maintain or even escalate conflict. Sources of conflict escalation. 1. Use of threats and counter-threats. Threats are messages of the intention by one person or group to behave in ways that are detrimental to the interest of another person or group, depending on what the latter does or does not do. Threats are one of the most common responses to conflict. They cost the initiator nothing and can gain concessions, especially when the target is weak. When involved in a conflict, many of us are tempted to use threats to get the other party to do our wishes, believing that we should, in the words of Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and carry the big stick. Parents commonly use threats to get their children to behave, and teachers often threaten their students with demerit or a visit to the principal. Threats are commonly used on an international scale as well, to further the interest of one nation over another. A classic series of studies by Deuce and Cross, 1960 and 1962, indicate, however, that threats are not an effective means of reducing conflict. Number 2, terrorism, the threat of the weak. In recent times, new and more dramatic terrorist acts seem to occur every year. In some cases, the act involves the bombing of a building or airplane. In other cases, terrorism carries the form of a kidnapping or a hostage taking. Terrorism is actual or threatened violence against non-combatants for avowed political ends. The aim of terrorism, unlike many situations we have discussed, is not an immediate resolution to conflict or even to short-term goals. The major aim of terrorism is to achieve worldwide attention and to instill or spread fear. The terrorists capture attention by enlisting the media. A terrible fire that claimed the life of several people may receive little more than a note in a local newspaper. But a hostage taken by terrorists is likely to make headlines in the newspapers around the world until the situation is resolved. Beyond the goal of arousing fear, terrorists aim to create conflict within the government involved. Governments are placed in a no-win situation. If they take a hardline stand and refuse to negotiate, they jeopardize the safety of innocent people and risk being branded as cold and uncaring. If they negotiate and make concessions to the terrorists, the government will be seen as weak and may invite future acts of terrorism. Thus, terrorism creates conflict within a conflict. In an effort to enhance the level of chaos and conflict, terrorists often target the most innocent of their victims, children, women, the elderly, and they make rather modest demands, such as the release of a few prisoners or the opportunity to get their message to the world. In this way, terrorists enlist the aid of the public to put pressure on government to negotiate. Terrorists often count on the fact that their threats and violence will be met with counter-threats and counter-violence by their targets, thereby escalating the scope of the conflict. Terrorism is generally a response to conflict by a weak group with a few resources. By itself, a single act of terrorism is generally not effective in achieving political goals or in overthrowing government. But the act can have broad implications and exert great costs from the target. When terrorism is stirred into the stew of intergroup conflict, the impact can be quite dramatic and wide-ranging, generally escalating the degree and the scope of conflict. 3. The importance of saving face. It is an increasingly common practice in many countries to resolve conflict in the court of law, whether the conflict involves two individuals in a divorce or countries in dispute over boundaries or trade practice. If we examine conflict closely, we find that participants have two motives. One is to gain as much as possible from the eventual resolution of the conflict. The second goal, often more important than the first, is to appear strong and tough. Group appearances in conflict are important for a number of reasons. If opposing groups perceive the group as weak or reluctant to take a strong stance, they may act to take advantage of this weakness by making more extreme demands. Second, as we pointed out, groups survive by their ability to retain existing members and to attract new members. Hence, it is important that groups have a positive public image. As a result, when the conflict gets played out in a public forum, groups often take a more extreme position and attempt to portray their strength by being unyielding. The concern with appearances in conflict situations is referred to as face saving. A number of investigators have suggested that the desire to save face often motivates people to resort to threats. People may feel that yielding is an admission of weakness. Such an admission not only is a blow to one's self-esteem, but also can lead to embarrassment and distress if other people witness this weakness. Conditions other than public observation can also cause people to attempt to save face in conflict. For example, the more a person has invested in a conflict, the more he or she will attempt to save face and resist yielding to demands. This investment can take the form of time. Effort, personal commitment, or material. This need to rationalize investment, that is cost, is similar to the phenomenon of effort justification. Number 4, trust and distrust. The lack of trust could work against even the most well-intentioned efforts to reduce conflict. Once distrust infects conflict, it seems that no force could reduce it. The perception of the other group as untrustworthy is probably a major source of tensions leading to conflict. The history of labor or management strife, interracial violence, war, and revolution demonstrate the significance of distrust. Distrust is difficult to change because it leads to the conflict spiral. The other person is perceived as a threat, which leads to conflict, which in turn leads to even greater distrust, and so on. Once a person has committed one betrayal, it is difficult for him or her to make up with the other person, because the wronged individual may believe that the betrayer will recur in future. Distrust has been presented as a terminal stage. Once it develops, it continues. This is certainly true in many cases, but the tide of distrust can be reversed if the wrongdoer has gained from the betrayer. The wrongdoer must attempt to make restitution. 5. Communication. Communication is an important key to the resolution of conflict. Yet, the initial tendency of parties in a conflict is often to withdraw and cease communication. Implied in the concept of trust in communication, trust is built on the communication of intentions and promises. The initial tendency of parties in a conflict to withdraw and cease communication has been called autistic hostility, because it is a form of hostility that ignores the reality that communication is essential for resolution of problems. The parties soon realize, however, that communication will be necessary if the conflict is to be resolved. And here arises an interesting dilemma. On the one hand, neither side wants to give the other information about its strengths, weaknesses, and desires that may be used against it. On the other hand, communication is vital if the parties are to ascertain the issues and develop solutions to the problem. The result of many studies show that overall, communication increases the chances for a positive resolution of conflict. But people in a conflict often must be forced to engage in communication. The timing of communication can also be important. For example, communication later in a conflict is more likely to have a positive effect than communication early in the conflict. Late communication may focus attention on cooperative aspects of the relationship and ways to reduce conflict, whereas early communication often focuses on the conflict and on threats. Reducing conflict. Relationships between groups can quickly become contentious. A disagreement between two people can become a struggle between two groups. We have examined some of the causes of a conflict and identified factors that contribute to maintaining the conflict once started. Let us now examine how to mitigate conflict. 1. Contact. Contact must satisfy certain prerequisites in order to reduce intergroup hostility. First, it must involve cooperation. Second, members of the group must be of equal status in order for contact to have positive consequences. That is, the situation under which the group members have contact must ensure that they have equal status or power. A third factor that increases the positive consequences of contact is preceding the contact with positive information about the out-group. The contact situations can serve to promote perceptions of out-group members as individuals when perceivers possess positive information about the group. 2. Cooperation and interdependence. One of the most productive means for reducing intergroup conflict is cooperation. For cooperation to occur, members of different groups must work together towards a superordinate goal, which is one that is attractive to the members of two groups but cannot be achieved without cooperation between the groups. Cooperation is a good means to reduce hostility for a number of reasons. First, it focuses the group members' attention away from their conflict and onto trying to solve the problem that confronts them. Second, cooperation reduces the salience of the in-group or out-group distinction. Groups that work together become more concerned with the task at hand and are less likely to categorize themselves as in-group and out-group. In a sense, all the members are now one group and have increased motivation to see others in a positive light because each person is dependent on all the others. It is interesting to note that conflict is not reduced when one party offers to help the other. Similarly, foreign aid programs often engender bad feelings in the recipients. It seems that helping, unlike cooperation, draws a distinct boundary between the helper and the recipient and places the helper in a more powerful position. As a result, the group boundary remains salient and the conflict remains. Also, although cooperation is effective in reducing conflict when the group succeeds in its efforts, failure in the cooperative effort can result in scapegoating and increased intergroup hostility. 3. Reducing threat. Not only does threat escalate conflict, but conflict often motivates the use of threats. Osgood, 1962, recognized this and pointed out that negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union were proceeding on a path directly contrary to conflict resolution. Each side was amassing threat potential, and the huge increase in weapons was making the possibility of accidental war more likely. Osgood suggested a way out of this spiraling increase in conflict. He called his plan the Graduated Reciprocation Intention Reduction, GRIT. In the first phase, which is aimed at enlisting public support, one party publicly announces that it intends to reduce tension and clearly states the unilateral initiatives that it plans to take to do so. That party should also invite the other party to reciprocate with its own initiative. The second phase is aimed at establishing the initiator's credibility and authenticity. During this phase, the initiator must carry out the announced tension-reducing motives in a way that is unambiguous and verifiable. These steps must be taken in the absence of reciprocation. The final point of the GRIT strategy relates to the need to have initiator retain enough power to avoid being exploited by the other party. These steps specify that the initiatives should be risky and create vulnerability in the initiator. Yet, they should not be so drastic that the initiator loses the ability to protect itself or to retaliate if the opponent responds aggressively. The idea behind GRIT is that moves by one nation or person to reduce threat capabilities will likely be met with similar reductions by others. Overall, research suggests that GRIT does work. That is, unilateral reductions of threat are often responded to with cooperative effort on the part of an opponent. 4. Depersonalizing conflict. The use of norms. Norms are rules that determine how behavior should legitimately progress. They are impersonal in that they are concerned with the situation rather than with the personalities of the problem. Take 2. They are impersonal in that they are concerned with the situation rather than with the personalities of the people in conflict. Efforts at conflict resolution that rely on norms are directed towards identifying a just and fair solution rather than which side is stronger or more capable. Some norms focus on the distribution of resources. Some norms deal with the needs of the two parties. Simply put, this norm states that the more need a person has, the more he or she should receive. A second norm is based on equality. According to this norm, Resources should be provided equally among the people involved in a social relationship. A third norm, the one studied by most social psychologists, is equity. According to this norm, the amount people receive from a relationship should be determined by how much they put into it. Certain norms tend to be used or preferred in certain situations. For example, need and equality norms are most likely to be used in cohesive groups that enjoy a positive emotional climate, friendship, families, etc. Whereas equity norms are common in non-cohesive groups. Deutz, 1975, argued that equity norms will be used in groups whose interest concern is productivity, whereas not when the main concern is developing positive social relations. Although norms can depersonalize conflicts, they do not always ensure smooth resolutions. There may be disagreements over which norm is the most appropriate one to use in the situation. 5. Third-party intervention, arbitration, and mediation. Outside parties can sometimes be recruited to help resolve conflict. Third parties can often intervene and present a new perspective that helps to resolve disputes. A third party is an individual or collective that is external to a dispute between two or more people and that tries to help them reach agreement. Third party can play many roles. The most common is a mediator who generally serves as an advisor, helping the parties clarify issues and agree on a solution. Another common third party is the arbitrator, who is vested with the power to impose the final solution after hearing the argument on both sides. Most recently, a hybrid has been introduced, the mediator or arbitrator, MEDAB, who will impose a settlement if mediation is not successful. The mere presence of the third party changes the nature of the interaction between the disputing parties, often diverting the attention of the parties away from their immediate disagreement and onto influencing that third party. This can have a positive effect on the conflict except in cases where the parties are themselves making progress toward a settlement. Mediators can help to resolve conflict in a number of ways. They can encourage communication between the parties in conflict and instruct them on methods of effective communication. They may help to focus attention on important issues rather than on more peripheral ones. They can help to identify new alternatives and suggest different perspectives on problems. They can help to balance power in the situation so that one party is not overwhelmed by the other. And they can help to resist premature conclusions to resolution efforts. Mediation is becoming increasingly popular as a means of handling civil conflicts, such as property settlement in divorce, landlord-tenant disputes, and consumer complaints. This effort to keep the dispute from clogging the court system and give participants an opportunity to develop resolution. This effort to keep the dispute from clogging the court system and give participants an opportunity to develop resolutions they are comfortable with. Many states have training and licensing procedures for mediators. 6. Negotiation. Negotiation is a form of communication between opposing sides in a conflict in which offers and counter-offers are made and a solution occurs only when both parties agree. Negotiations on complex issues such as nuclear arms control and international environmental protection, as well as efforts to make peace in volatile regions such as the Middle East, often go on for decades. But negotiations are not restricted to the international scene. Unions and management engage in collective bargaining to establish employee contracts. Divorcing couples negotiate the terms of their divorce by themselves or through their lawyers. Dating couples negotiate about which movie to attend. Families negotiate about who does which annoying household chores. Indeed, negotiation can occur whenever there is a conflict that the parties wish to resolve without getting into an open fight or relying on an imposed legal system. There is an immense amount of research on negotiation and bargaining. But here, the focus is on those most relevant to conflict reduction. The most common successful outcome is an 80-50 compromise. Here, the negotiator starts at extreme positions and gradually work towards a mutually acceptable midpoint. Some negotiators, however, achieve an even higher level of success. Most negotiations are not simply fixed sum. Situations in which each side must give up something until a middle point is reached. Instead, there exist ways in which both sides can benefit when an integrative agreement is reached. Both parties obtain outcomes that are superior to a 50-50 split. The ability to achieve integrative agreement is an acquired skill. Experienced negotiators obtain them more often than do inexperienced ones. Some key elements in negotiating successfully include flexibility, communicating and trying to understand the point of view of the other person. A team of negotiators is more likely to elicit integrative agreement than an individual negotiator. Some negotiations rely on an arbitrator who has the power to impose a settlement, but it is more common for conflicting parties to request the participation of a mediator who works with them to try to reach a voluntary agreement. One limit to successful negotiation is that people often assume they are locked in a conflict in which only one party can come out ahead. They don't realize that solutions favorable to both parties are available. 7. Integrative solution. Integrative solution is a solution to a conflict whereby the parties make trade-offs on issues according to their different interests. Each side concedes the most on issues that are unimportant to it, but important to the other side. People often find it difficult to identify integrative solutions. This is because the more the people have at stake in a negotiation, the more biased their perceptions of their opponent. They will tend to distrust proposals made by their opponent and to overlook the interests they have in common. In sum, when you are negotiating with someone, it is important to keep in mind that integrative solutions are often available. Try to gain the other's trust and communicate your own interests in an open manner. Remember that the way you construe the situation is not necessarily the same way as the other party construes it. You may well discover that the other side communicates its interests more freely as a result, increasing the likelihood that you will find a solution beneficial to both parties. Social dilemmas. What is best for an individual is not always best for the group as a whole. The notion that the pursuit of self-interest can sometimes be self-destructive forms the basis for what is called a social dilemma. There are many perspectives on how people respond to social dilemmas, including sociological studies of social movements, historical, economic, and political analysis of international relations. Factors affecting social dilemma. The psychological factors that influence people's behavior in a social dilemma include individual and cultural differences, situational factors, and group dynamics. One individual difference among people is how concerned they are for their own outcomes relative to others. People with a cooperative orientation are less likely to behave in a competitive, resource-consuming fashion than are people with individualistic or competitive orientations, according to Park, 1994. Another individual difference concerns how trusting people are. There are also cultural differences in how people behave in social dilemmas. Situational factors and group processes also affect how people respond in social dilemmas. Situational factors include variations in people's moods, recent experiences with social dilemmas, exposure to role models or norms that encourage competition or cooperation, communication among group members, and expectations about others' behaviors. The size of the group also affects responses to social dilemmas. Large groups are more likely to exploit scarce resources than are small ones. There are three major reasons for the influence of group size. First, it's harder to identify with the welfare of others when the group is large, and people are more socially responsive when they share a meaningful group membership with other people affected by the dilemma. Second, people believe that their actions have more of an impact in a smaller group. And thirdly, people are likely to have more face-to-face interactions and greater communications with the others in a smaller group, making members more likely to establish and enforce commitment and norms to cooperate, recognize common interests, and engage in long-range thinking. Social dilemmas also involve very large groups, a city, a state, a nation, the whole world. The most commonly employed structural solution to social dilemmas is to set up a controlling authority. To solve a social dilemma, people often have to decide whether to place their trust in their fellow citizens or in government. Strategies for mitigating social dilemma. 1. Prisoner's dilemma. One of the most common ways of studying social dilemmas in the laboratory is with a game called the prisoner's dilemma. In the game of prisoner's dilemma, two people have to choose one of two options without knowing what the other person will choose. The number of points they win depend on the options chosen by both people. People's actions in these games seem to mirror many conflicts in everyday life. To find a solution desirable to both parties, people must trust each other. Often they do not, and this lack of trust leads to an escalating series of competitive moves, so that in the end, no one wins. According to Bastin Ahmad, 2001. Two countries locked in an arms race may feel that they cannot afford to disarm out of fear that the other side will take advantage of their weakened position. The result is that both sides add furiously to their stockpile of weapons, neither gaining superiority over the other, and both spending money they could use to solve domestic problems. Such an escalation of conflict is also seen all too often among couples who are about to divorce. Sometimes, the goal seems more to hurt the other person than to further one's own needs or the children's. In the end, both suffer because, metaphorically speaking, they both choose option Y too often. Such escalating conflict, though common, is not inevitable. To increase cooperation, you can also try the tit-for-tat strategy, which is a way of encouraging cooperation by at first acting cooperatively, but then always responding the way your opponent did, cooperatively or competitively, on the previous trail. This strategy communicates a willingness to cooperate and an unwillingness to sit back and be exploited if the partner does not cooperate. The tit-for-tat strategy is always successful in getting cooperative, trusting response. Another proven strategy is to allow individuals to resolve a conflict rather than opposing groups. because two individuals who play the same game. Another proven strategy is to allow individuals to resolve a conflict rather than opposing groups. The reason for this is that people are more likely to assume that another individual is cooperative at heart and can be trusted, but that most groups of individuals will, given the opportunity, stab us in the back. Public goods dilemma. This occurs when individuals must contribute to a common pool in order to maintain the public good, such as paying taxes for public schools. It is to each individual's advantage to pay as little as possible, but if everyone adopts this strategy, everyone suffers. 3. Commons dilemma. This is a situation in which everyone takes from a common pool of goods that will replenish itself if used in moderation, but will disappear if overused. This dilemma derives its name from an example in which there is a common grassy area in the middle of a town on which all the residents are permitted to let their sheep graze. This is a classic social dilemma because it is to each individual farmer's benefit to let each of our sheep graze as much as possible. But if all farmers do this, the commons will be overgrazed and the grass will disappear. Modern examples include the use of limited resources, such as water and energy. Individuals benefit by using as much as they need, but if everyone does so, shortages eventually result. Study session summary. From the study session, we are able to see that people often have incompatible goals, placing them in conflict with each other. The notion that the pursuit of self-interest can sometimes be self-destructive forms the basis for what is called a social dilemma. Kinds of social dilemmas include prisoner's dilemma, public goods dilemma, and the commons dilemma. Another proven strategy is to allow individuals to resolve a conflict rather than opposing groups. End of study session 5. Thank you for listening.